Can you guys see that on the Zoom, okay?
Yeah.
That's just something like pretty good crowd. Nice.
Have you read the February 2022?
Yeah.
Have you read The Singularity is Near?
Yeah. Great first one.
Yeah. Makes mad keyboards.
You might like this. Yeah. All right.
I know. Brain food.
Cool headline, isn't it?
I know, it might be a little bit.
Yeah.
Looking forward to being informed.
Yeah.
I know, right?
Yeah. All right. How are we going, Kat? Any more? Cool.
I think it'll be crack on. I think it's useful. Yeah.
Cool. I'm recording anyway. So.
Alright.
All right, I might get started. Thanks, guys. My name's Luke, for those of you who don't know me, or the deep end. Brain-computer interfaces, something I've been looking into for quite a long time, and I find really fascinating, both in terms of how they're being used now and how they might be used in the future. Those of you who don't know, I actually study psychology, and so eventually this is kind of field that I want to get into, because I think it's really going to change how we interact with each other and, medicine. We'll get into it, you'll see. So by the end of the talk, I hope that you will understand a little bit about BCIs, or brain-computer interfaces, and how they work. Some examples of what's going on, like I mentioned, some ethical considerations, which I think a lot of you probably already have in your mind. And then, where we may be able to go with it as a species.
Go to species. That's a good,
Yeah.
That is a good take now.
Some lunch and learn.
I know. I'm going to have to up my game. All right.
So on a really basic level, a brain-computer interface is just something that either takes information from the brain to be processed by a computer, or it uses electrical signals to stimulate the brain and, perform changes in the brain of some description. A little bit of background on neuroscience, just so enough that you understand. In the brain, there's billions and billions and billions of cells called neurons, and they all talk to each other, and they form every experience that you've ever had, ever will have, probably. And so when those neurons talk to each other, there's an electrical signal that happens, and this is recordable by a computer. So if we use electrodes, we can determine how much that is firing at any given time. So different parts of the brain will have different regions that are responsible for different things. So some uses. Medical treatment and research is probably the biggest one right now. And I think one of the most important ones to focus on, because there's a lot of potential here. For Alzheimer's, epilepsy, concussions, things like this, we can sort of see what's going on in the brain at a very fine level of detail, so that we can both prevent these things from happening. Like, for example, with epilepsy, we might be able to say, okay, well, the brain was in this state when this person was about to have a seizure. And so we can sort of map that out and say, well, okay, we can prevent it from happening in the future. And potentially with the writing part of the brain stimulation, we may be able to stimulate certain areas that would actually help people with Alzheimer's or whatever to remember their old memories or whatever it is. The tech's not quite there yet, but idealistically we could do that. Gaming, there's a lot of neuro gaming applications that are coming out now. So there's like first-person shooters where you think where you want to aim, and then you think firing the shot. And there's a multiplayer games and stuff like that.
Oh, no,
Yeah. Oh,
you know that's only one step away from the real thing, right?
yeah. It gets better. It gets better. So art, there's a lot of like interactive art exhibitions and stuff that use neural signals to do different things. Like this lady was making water move and vibrate and creating all these patterns just using certain brainwaves in her mind. Cognitive enhancement for training and learning. There's a lot of papers and stuff coming out about this using what's called neurofeedback. So neurofeedback is basically you perform a task in a psychologist study or something like that, and your brain signals are recorded, but then they're presented to you on a screen so you can tell, okay, now I'm focusing, or now I'm stressed, or whatever it is, and that then in turn influences your performance on an ongoing basis. So it's a sort of a feedback loop that begins to be established. Security, biometric authentication. This is something I just found out about today. But yeah, so instead of using your fingerprint, we could have a unique brain ID. Like I said, this is this person's brain, which is kind of scary and crazy and kind of cool as well. Psychopathology, so for psychiatrists and psychologists, a lot of biofeedback is being used for anxiety to create alpha and beta waves, I believe it is, which is the calm state. So perhaps if someone is talking about trauma or something like that, we can create a much nicer state for them to be able to get better clinical outcomes for that. Rehabilitation as well. So I actually used to work for a company called Tech Gym that does stroke rehabilitation using robotics. And I think I always thought when I was working there that this kind of thing would be really, really good to determine how well someone's improving when they've forgotten how to use their muscles. Because the brain can be retrained to do all these things, but using a computer to feed back into that would make it 100 times more powerful. Addiction as well. So, people, again, being put into those relaxed states when they're presented with triggers, perhaps. I know there's a lot of VR applications out there now for addiction and fears and traumas and all these sorts of things. So you can simulate a sort of dangerous or triggering environment without actual consequences of that environment, like a relapse. And using this technology, we can determine when the person is at risk for a relapse. And then sort of, manage it from there. Neuromarketing, this is a really interesting one. So slightly contentious. So we already kind of do this with our phones and websites that we interact with analytics and stuff like that. So, they say, okay, well, this person hovered over this link for this many seconds, and then we're going to feed that into machine learning and say like, okay, well, we can optimize the website so that we get the most amount of sales. This is just taking it to the next level. Basically, how engaged is your brain when you're looking at a website or looking at some sort of marketing? So, a company might pay for a trial and say, oh, all these people's brains were stimulated in this way when we presented the information in this way. And so we're going to.
So are you familiar with Hotjar? It does a visualization.
Yeah.
That could take.
Yeah, you could have
That's the next
brain
iteration of
Hotjar,
that, right?
Yeah, brain in a jar. Just like Futurama. So different types of BCIs. At the first level, so it goes in scales of how invasive they are. These are the main consumer applications that you'll see, which is a bunch of electrodes, just like basically pieces of pieces of metal on the scalp. And so this is using EEG technology, which is the main thing that's used in psychology and neuroscience studies in fMRI machines and that sort of thing. And so this is very cheap, relatively speaking. They come down a lot. The emotive headset, which I'll go into in a sec. I think there was a deep end project.
Yeah, we've got one.
Oh yeah, there's one in this building somewhere, I think. Yeah. And it's very simple. I think it's only 3 or 4 of these electrodes. Basically, the more of these electrodes that you have on the scalp, the more regions of the brain that you can look at. So it's really great because it's cheap and people feel comfortable using it. But there are a lot of challenges getting accurate information because you have to go through the hair and the skull and the bone. Exactly.
Has anyone done invasive?
Oh yeah.
Right.
So I'll get
Brains up there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this is an example of what you might see from like the plotted information from one of these non-invasive headsets. So you can see all the electrodes in the different areas of the scalp, and you can move those around. And if we look here, for example, across the middle is the motor cortex of the brain. And so you could align all of these electrodes up here to detect signals in your arms or the legs moving and that sort of thing, which is a pretty common application because they make very big neural spikes. So they're quite easy to detect. So yeah, motive, like I mentioned, is often used for meditation because those sorts of brainwaves are quite easy to detect. And so that can feed back in the form of music or something like that, saying, okay, now you're in a meditative state, or now you're not in a meditative state, and you can sort of fine tune. And also I noticed that if you have one of these headsets, you can actually get paid to participate in studies. So they have a bunch of stuff and you just get paid for 10 minutes of your time. And I guess you're selling your brain product, which is questionable.
Right now, though,
Yeah,
right?
super valuable. Yeah, because this technology is still very new. So we're really looking to push it. So yeah, there's a reason they're paying for it. Cochlear implants as well are actually brain-computer interfaces that are used a lot. So basically, you have a little microphone on the outside of the ear, which just captures audio data from the world. And then that wirelessly transmits to this receiver, which has been implanted by a surgeon. And then that feeds down into these electrodes and these wires, which actually go directly to the nerve fiber that processes audio information in the brain. So if you've basically got damage in this region, we're skipping that entirely and going straight to the nerve so that people can have better hearing. And this can obviously be upgraded with better quality microphones and all that sort of stuff. It does require retraining when people have these implanted because the sounds that they hear or the way that they're interpreting those sounds is going to be different than that of someone without this sort of injury. So the next level down, semi-invasive. This is when we place a grid of electrodes on the surface of the brain. So there's some surgery that happens usually at the top of the head. Yeah. So it looks very graphic, and it is. There's no getting around that. So basically, a layer of the head is cut off, and there are several electrodes placed in a grid, and these actually give a much higher level of accuracy because you're not having to go through the skull and all that sort of thing. There are some potential complications with scar tissues forming and that sort of thing once you get in there. But yes, it's much more resistant to noise as well. And by noise, we mean there are like sort of distracting neural signals that we can get with the non-invasive headsets. Like if you blink your eyes, for example, it makes a massive spike. And so that might get in the way of what you're trying to record. So this kind of gets around that. But obviously this is pretty hectic. So at the moment, it's only used in epilepsy patients or people that are blind or paralyzed, just people that actually really need it. And then invasive, we can go even deeper. So this is going inside the brain tissue itself to target the smallest amount of neurons possible. So as you'll see in the next few slides, they've got this down to about a group of 1,000 neurons, which is pretty good considering there's like 100 billion neurons in the brain. Still can be some scarring and that sort of thing, but this is getting a little bit better. But yeah, for people that are blind and severely paralyzed or disabled, this is a potential solution. And so this is just kind of a recap of the non-invasive is right outside the scalp. The ECOG, which is the semi-invasive, is either above or below the dura, which is a layer just below the skull. And then I can't even pronounce that word, but that means to go inside the brain tissue and monitor really, really specific areas of the brain. So some examples. Neuralink, if you guys know about Neuralink, it's, sorry, is it a movie? I don't know, maybe.
Kansas Transit System.
Or maybe that's where he got the idea from for the company. It's Elon Musk's company, Elon Musk BCI company. So this is kind of the state of the art in terms of what's being developed in BCIs. So they have robots that will do this surgery, because no human's hand is controlled enough to be able to do something like this, because the person will be, under general anesthetic, and even their breathing and their eye movements will cause enough shaking that the human might mess it up. So you need a very, very good robot.
It's pretty spooky. Robots.
Yep.
Again, put those things on humans are
Completely out of it, yeah. But this is being done in animals right now, which I'll get to. But they've got clinical trials in humans. They're planning for the end of this year. I don't know if they're going to get FDA approval. Pardon?
Yeah, are there any deaths that recorded with this research? Like,
What's that?
are there any like deaths and stuff?
Yeah, I'll get to it. I'll get to it. Yeah. It's gonna be tricky. It's gonna be a long road. But they have demonstrated that they can safely insert and remove from pigs these links. And the pigs, even after several months, seem to be completely fine.
So when you say write information on there, does that mean you can tell the system to impact those neurons?
Yes. So what you have, so these are the conditions that they want to try to get around. So it's kind of what I covered before. But basically, this is the link itself. So there's 1,024 little electrodes here, and each of these like tiny wires go into like tiny portions of the brain. Depending on what you want to monitor, you can put it wherever you like. And then there's an iPhone app, which is pretty wild. You can pair with your own brain, basically. So in the demonstration that they did, they put some pigs on a treadmill, and what you're seeing here is basically two lines on the graph. One is the actual movement of the pig's, let's say, elbow or shoulder, and then the other one is what the predicted movement would be from the neural reading. So the pig has one of these chips in its brain, and it's reading that information, and the pig's brain is saying, okay, I want to move my elbow a bit this way now. And so that's outputting here, and you can see it's basically 1 for 1. So yeah, so they're getting pretty good with this stuff. There is an embedded video here. So they put it into a monkey, and they taught the monkey to play Pong with its brain. So basically, yeah, look, you can see him pairing the iPhone here, and there's a chip in the back of its skull around there. It's being given a banana smoothie as a reward. So every time, so this is the first phase, it's moving this joystick to locate areas on the screen. It's just learning. So not even Pong yet. It's just the link is learning how the monkey associates thoughts about movement with actual movements. So every time it successfully gets one of these orange squares, it gets a bit of banana smoothie. And then you can see. That was good. And then that's being fed into a computer, and you can see these little spikes. So these are every time it moves it successfully, it'll generate a spike. And so this is being recorded and fed through algorithms to determine how the monkey might move in future. Oh, let's skip it again. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so now, so in the second phase here, we can see the joystick is completely unplugged. So the monkey is not moving it with his hand. It's completely controlled with his brain. He's just moving the joystick out of habit. But yeah, it's being completely controlled. So he's thinking, okay, I want to move it up to the right now. I want to move it left. So I want to move it down. And so it's pretty fascinating. And then at the end,
so it's hands just following his brain, but it's not.
That's right. And you can see here, look, he's not even touching the controller. And he's the one on the right. So he's playing Pong. Yeah, so it's the thought of, because every time you move your muscle, your brain is sending signals down your spine.
Let's increase the see how well pigeon.
Yep, exactly. So they want to, and I'll get to applications with that in a sec. But yes, it's someone that's completely paralyzed.
As you can see, pigeon is amazingly good when he's focused.
It's the thought. So like when he moves, when someone moves their hand, like my brain is sending signals down my spine, it goes all the way down to my arm. And so that can be recorded because it fires here and then it gets sent. So at the firing, they can tell what his intentional movement was.
Better reward for someone.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, because he's thinking the same thing.
His hands just
Yeah.
doing that
As a reflex.
Just because he thinks that's what feedback. Yeah.
But it's one and the same, isn't it? Because it's this. Well, if the hand, yeah, we can get into it later. Okay, so this is something I've been looking at recently. This is the Galea headset. So this is actually combining a bunch of different biosensing signals into one device. So this is something I signed up for the beta program for. I'm really hoping they send me one. So we have, okay, so heart, skin, muscle, eye, and brain data all in the one device, and a VR headset plugged in right here. So the idea is that you could play like a video game, for example, and you would get this really, really detailed map of your physiological profile at all times. So it could tell how emotional you're feeling in this game. And then in real time, it could change the game to make it more scary or, you know, more fun or whatever it is, or change the music or anything you like. Also, not just gaming though, we can have, you know, educational opportunities with this. So for example, someone learning to do surgery, we can like determine, okay, they're feeling nervous or whatever, so we need to change the simulator to teach them better. Many applications. Other types of biosensing, this one's really cool. You mentioned like paralyzed people. So this guy lost both of his arms and he was able to control these bionic arms just with his mind. This is slightly different from a brain-computer interface because you can see he's not wearing a headset, but these are just little wireless modules in specific parts of the muscles. Yeah, so it's just detecting muscle movement, and that muscle movement gets fed to a computer, which then talks back to the arm. So his pec, for example, might want to do this kind of movement, and then the computer receives that, sends it to the robot arm, and moves up and down. It's still slightly rudimentary at this point, but considering, you know, the state he was in before, I think he is pretty stoked. So yeah, very cool. Brain-to-brain interfaces. This is something else I discovered recently, kind of spooky. So let's say two people are wearing a brain-computer interface. One person is looking on a screen, and there's a game where they have to fire a cannon once there's like an enemy ship above. And so they give the neural signal to say, okay, I'm going to fire now. That gets sent through a server to someone else who's wearing a brain-computer interface that stimulates their brain, and then that moves their finger to hit the button. So as you can see here, it's a proof of concept to show that a human being can be controlled by another human being. So that's kind of wild. Exactly. So, you know, you could hack someone's brain and make them do something potentially. But, you know, another, like, I guess, lighter application of this might be like something more empathetic. Like maybe in the future we could understand exactly how someone's feeling and how they experience the world, which is, you know, something that we could never even dream of before. So that's a photo of them doing the experiment. Possible future stuff. So connectomes is basically a computer mapping of all the connections in the brain. So this is a really, really big task considering there's so many connections in the brain. So there's 100 billion neurons and each of those have several connections. So it's just exponentially large. But we have managed to do this in very, very small animal brains. So there's a type of worm that we've actually mapped the entire brain. So these are all the synaptic connections in its brain itself, and then going down its central nervous system to its body. So there's about 300 neurons compared to 100 billion. So it's a lot easier. But still, that's about 7,000 connections between all these things. So I think this even took like 5 or 10 years to do. So it's very slow progress. But then, of course, someone put that information into a Lego robot, and then they were able to control the Lego robot using the reanimated worm brain, which is like. So some challenges, there are like computing power bottlenecks for these human connectomes. Just processing that amount of information is like not something we can currently do. Maybe with quantum computing, that could be a potential application. It's hard to make generalizable models of neural data, which what I mean by that is the amount of these headsets that are being used compared to how many different unique brains there are in the world, it's a huge disparity. So the people that are researching this stuff, they might get it to work for their brain, but everyone's brain is so different. So making, machine learning algorithms or whatever that will, make a model that will work for everyone is something that will take a while.
They'll have to keep like a setup phase, like when you buy these systems.
Exactly.
Each user has to go home and spend.
You have to train it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's right.
You can't do it off the shelf.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's already in these applications, like that kind of training program. But yeah, getting it to work for everyone straight away would be cool. It's uncomfortable to wear and it's hard to get the head to fit, the caps to fit on all these different head shapes and different hair types and thicknesses and stuff like that. And that affects the quality of the signal. And also the public perception, particularly with like sci-fi films and stuff, it's going to be hard for a lot of people to want to invest in this technology. But I recommend it personally. There are some ethics and stuff like that. So privacy, like I mentioned before, like selling your data, like that becomes particularly trepidatious once you upload your brain information. And like reversibility, are some of these changes permanent? We don't understand the brain much at all, considering how complicated it is. So there may be some simulations that have unintended consequences. Also, cost is going to be a big factor as well. So if we have these sort of like AI, BCI, superhumans, it's going to be an expensive technology, at least at first. So, it's going to be tricky trying to balance that and make it sort of available for everyone. And Neuralink as well, as I was getting to, I think last week, there's something that came out that said they were abusing the monkeys that were being used for testing. And there was a lot of media frenzy about it. I kind of looked into it. It seems like based on the actual laws in California, they weren't doing anything wrong, but I guess it depends where you fall on the spectrum of animal testing versus human progress. So it's a tricky.
So everything they do will be targeted by animal rights groups as well.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting to read about. So I guess you make your own mind up about that. But I guess these things have to happen sort of if we want to understand and change the technology. Yeah, thank you. That's all.
Really cool.
BCI can help in the field of rehabilitation, especially with visualization techniques. People are suffering from muscle injuries and traumas. There's already a technique where they can visualize those muscles impact and exercise. Do you see with BCI that could be enhanced?
Definitely.
Quite severe injuries and disabilities could still be.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good application of neurofeedback. I think at the moment, like even without any of this technology or whatever, the way that the brain sort of relearns things, if you actually picture a motion in your head of like playing a guitar or something like that, you can actually get better at playing the guitar just by thinking about those movements, because neurally it looks quite similar, which is like to the point that Matt was making earlier. So yeah, absolutely. If you can have visual feedback of that as well, particularly in VR, like VR has been really good for rehabilitation and brain training. So yes, absolutely, that would be fantastic.
So do you think it will be avatars starting the whole trend, or do you think?
I don't know. I think just human curiosity and ingenuity started the whole trend, and like the increases in processing power and stuff like that. But I think people have been thinking about this stuff for a long time. And only now is it starting to be possible to have meaningful outcomes.
What do you think of the feedback loop? I disagree with that. I don't reckon we should have a thing on our head that says if I'm sad, quick, get happy. I feel like I have to go through it.
Yeah.
Back to that side. And I feel like that might have a huge impact. People go, oh, I can just always be happy. Right, right?
Yeah, who knows?
It depends though, because if you have, and again, some of the examples like of people with epilepsy or that have had a stroke or things like that. So if someone is in a state of full depression or anxiety that they are able to manage on their own, if that is basically replacing the medication, which does get your brain to produce that chemical in order to come back to a normal level of function. And they never want you to be on the medication forever, but it is trying to reset the brain to that balanced, chemistry. So I see that as being
Yeah,
very
It's like an electric antidepressant.
you wouldn't have the long-term side effects.
A big pharma involved in this? Like, are they fighting this stuff or are they on board with it? Like,
Not sure.
people are going to lose antidepressant pills and put a headset on.
I don't know if it's on their radar because I think it's really tricky with emotions. Like emotions are really, really, really complicated in the brain. It's not as simple as like, oh, there's a happy center in the brain and a sad center or whatever. It's like really, really complex. So I don't know if it's on their radar right now because of the technical infeasibility of something like that. And the amount of clinical trials and testing and stuff like that will be required is like, we're pretty far off from that, I think. I think, the therapeutic aspects are more going to be in tandem with things that already exist. So it's like part of your therapy treatment, for example, like you're already seeing a psychologist and then he or she is saying like, okay, well, we can see that when I do this sort of treatment, then the brain responds in this way. And that's a much
That's very
safer
much
way.
how they're using VR.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it would
Just
pair so well with
yeah.
those VR applications. Yeah.
What are the use cases currently physiological? So all of those examples, even you got someone to shoot someone, it's like you make them press the button. But is there any instances where you can change actually what someone thinks or their memory, or you can change their
So from
emotion?
more kind of CBT stuff.
So because even the sort of happiness examples you were talking to, it's tracking your happiness and then changing external stimuli as opposed to changing actually how your mind thinks.
Yeah.
Are they actually experimenting with things?
Also, you're asking if there's
Would you
any
change
direct
someone's memory?
change.
Would you change,
So
if someone's a sociopath, then you rewire their brain. So they maybe don't start killing people.
I think right now,
Or vice versa, if you're
yeah.
on the other side of the equation.
yeah, sure.
Like the dangerous side.
So I think right now that's not really happening, but I don't think there's anything there's no law of physics that stops that from being possible because all brain states are just connections in the brain. It's just like ones and zeros basically. It's like it's connected to another neuron or it's not. So in theory, if we have these connectomes and they're really, really in-depth and complicated, then yes, I think we could change something like that. But right now, we're basically using the brain's existing capacity for neural plasticity or brain change to help the user change their brain in their own way without direct stimulation. So that's more of their reading information like you just described. But yeah, I think in theory it's definitely possible. But that might have consequences that we have no idea about.
So I was saying before about is it the actual thought? Because the thought is different from the electrical signal that creates the thought will be different from the electrical signal that is sent to the muscles to move. Brain might be motor headset or whatever the headset could easily be picking up basically a combination of both of those. As you pulled out, this is the thought to move now.
Yes.
This is the electrical signal to move now.
That's
So
right.
I think most of it is physiological. It's not tapping into what that thought was and what's instructed.
Well, I guess presumably it's probably because we understand musculoskeletal physiology much more than we understand.
Right.
And
Yeah.
science,
Yeah.
psychology of why we do things.
Mhm.
So probably they can, but then they could make much better antidepressants anyway, or they can solve that problem without probably putting a chip in your brain. So
Right.
it kind of goes hand in hand.
Last night in preparation for this preparation. I recently got
Into
a.
the chip.
I did.
Wow.
Get out of
I
here.
got upset. So I recently got a VR set and the last night I jumped on just to play with a couple of things, and one of them was I went to a museum exhibition and people were actually walking towards me. And I had my legs stretched out, and because they were towards me, actually, as they were walking, my brain signal automatically told my legs to be careful.
Yeah.
No, but I could feel the
Yeah.
sensation going there. So the signal was legs, and my legs acted to it.
Mm.
And it was a nice one. So then after that, the roller coaster thing that they've got in VR. And without thinking about it, I just let myself go. And my stomach was actually going through motions
Yeah.
and turning and dizziness.
Mm.
But at one stage, my air conditioner, which I was really close to, it actually became highlighted with the moment that I was in, and I could feel air. Nobody was crazy.
You're having more fun in lockdown than me.
No, but this is last night. So it was, I did have a few whiskey. No, but it was, I found it really interesting, and then I did roller coaster again, but this time I was actually, I brought myself aware to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this time I didn't have that sensation. And then halfway through, I let go again, and my stomach started going through motion.
Oh, wow.
It's actually quite amazing.
Interesting.
It
It's
was-
interesting you can switch back.
Yeah,
That's kind of cool.
yeah. So I mean, I think that right now we can experience this without being plugged in as we become
Yeah.
aware of what's actually what we're doing.
Yes.
Virtually.
Definitely.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, I found the same thing with VR. Like once I got used to it, and there was more like, okay, I'm actually using this thing as opposed to like having it happen to me, and that conscious control was put into it. Like it wasn't as scary, and admittedly not as fun in some ways. Because I think like when the first time you put on a VR headset, it's kind of like, oh, like, you know, like you've never had that field of view in a virtual world before. But you do kind of get used to it. Then, you know, the more of these physiological senses and stuff you put in, the more novelty that we can put into games and stuff. So, yeah. It's pretty cool.
If anybody wants to see a practical example, we used one of the headsets technology. It's far less altruistic or far less far-reaching, but we basically had a video case study on Beacon's website that we put the EEG, the remote headset on. We measured people's brain signals. We created art from those brain signals, unique to individual people. Have a look at it. It's quite a very shallow.
I was going to ask if
usage of it.
what about musicians, any users doing the.
Yeah. Chris, didn't you send me something where it was like about learning how to play the piano using one of these things? So it's like gives you real-time information of like how close you hit the note and that sort of thing. But yeah, like to generating music stuff and stuff as well. Like I'm sure, you know, you have a synthesizer and you have different parameters of that synthesizer, and you can control it with your minor.
That would make an awesome NFT. You can get like an artist plugged in for them to perform a song. Yeah. Imagine an artist NFT, which is unique to that moment.
Yeah, wow.
You tell them something amazing you did and capture that.
Yeah.
information at
Yeah.
that moment.
Yeah.
This is the moment that you were told you were going to do that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was kind of the flawless one. So the concept behind it, the client was flawless, which was demonstrating the efficacy of their product and truly supporting brain health. And so the idea was to capture the moment of inactive activity, emotion, and different individuals, and then that translation directly into a piece of art to show the efficacy of the mind, basically, and the need to love your mind. Yeah. So from a campaign perspective, it's kind of like touch from a clinical perspective, I would say, but we're creative now.
Yeah. Nice. That's pretty cool.
Well, that's going to be for a long time still to come. There's going to be a lot of hype and PR and around this stuff, but it's still going to be pretty low level. Like you say, there's no full-on invasive stuff happening at this stage.
Yeah. I think it's going to take a while for people to trust it first of all, and also the tech to get there. I think Neuralink is doing some crazy stuff. Like that's just the stuff that they've shown us, right? So it's
I
like,
think we'll get there. I think there's a time when people used to be scared about putting credit card numbers on the
Yeah.
internet.
and if you think about it, like you feel like you've lost a limb if you leave your phone at home or something like that. Like we're already so connected to technology. It's kind of just that next step. And people have it in their watches and stuff. It's becoming even more like, oh, I don't even have to hold the thing.
Yeah.
So it's like the next step.
That's what I was thinking about the Apple Watch. There's nothing that could just sink that into your skin and not have a wristband. You know what I mean?
Well, do you see that guy who got the Opal card implanted into his arm?
Oh,
Yeah, Meow Ludo Meow Meow. That's his real name. And yeah, like he won some lawsuit because they were like, oh, you can't tamper with the chip or whatever, like New South Wales government. And then he was like, oh no, I can't. And so he was just like, going through the reader.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the inspector gets on. Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, how surgeons are now using VR for pressing. So surgeons are only trained, a lot of the breast surgeons, they're using VR for equally measuring sweat through EEG sets during that process. And seeing what surgical VR experiences are actually working and what are not. They're almost connecting the two there, which is already being used with ease.
Yeah, nice. That's awesome.
This is making the assumption that the data in our brains is coming from our brains. But the phone, if you carry a phone down and I play a song, I
primitive brain might say that the data is coming from the device itself. But what if it's not? Because everything you show today, it depends on visual information that is measurable, quantifiable. But we know that that's only 50% of the picture. What affects us, our motivations, what we do, is tangible and intangible. So what about the intangible?
Well, the assumption of this kind of technology is that at some level, everything that you experience is actually mechanistic, which is kind of like this whole other argument of determinism and all that stuff. But basically, you listen to that song and then your brain knows, okay, the frequencies up here and down here and down here are being registered. And like I put together this like mental map of like, okay, this is a song. And then further out from that, we have concepts of music and art and that sort of thing. And these become extremely complex interactions in the brain. But according to modern neuroscience, people do believe that they are still just connections to the brain at the end of the day.
Yes, but you know, Freud said that we are three sections. We are the id, the body, and superego.
Yep.
All of this sounds like it's superego, so not so much the id. But the id has a lot of information that is all emotional and symbolic, non-tangible. Just like quantum, big problem with quantum is we try to have it definitive, but we can't. Because the assumption is with all modern sciences that things have to be definitive before we can move forward.
Sure.
But that's not all picture. A lot of it is intangible, unmeasurable things. And I guess
You can measure the pattern of what that intangible looks like. So you can find out it's just a signal.
but
If the synapses go boom, 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 so hungry, then it's a day, boom, 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 it's hungry.
It's not like home.
And the book is the donut.
Yeah. So I see it as a synapse, a pattern of synapse.
But I think you still have a really good point. It's just that, in my view, that a lot of that intangible stuff is currently still intangible because we can't measure it with the current technology. But I don't think it's out of. Pardon?
do you think we can reach a point where we can measure everything?
Potentially.
We can measure measurement itself.
Yeah.
No, but I don't think so. I don't believe that we can reach one because that's a juxtaposition in itself. Sorry, I mean contradiction.
Yeah.
There has to be always a room for uncertainty, right? We can't have uncertainty. There's no way.
I mean, I think humans like to think that we can overcome that, but maybe you're right. I don't know. It's possible.
It's very interesting. Very enlightening.
Nice.
Now I have a-
Very
Oh, really?
Thank you.
Okay.
Very
All right, no worries. What was
I'm very interested in this one.
They're trying out.
Because I know, looking at philosophically, every time we create a universe, whether it's a definition, it's a definition, in that instant, the universe creates four other things. The opposite of it by definition, and then a third coordinate, which is a combination of it and its opposite by definition. And then a fourth coordinate, which is neither it nor its opposite nor an infinite combination. And that fourth coordinate is always going to be in our line spot. Because it almost gives that line of exists every time we create a definition. So in a way, the more definitions we create, the more line spots we create. And the less definitions we create, the less line spots. You see how it's not so binary after all. I'll give you an example. So let's say there's X. We create a definition of something X. In that moment we create X, there is Y. Because it's not X, it's the opposite of X by definition, right? So now we have X and Y. But in the moment that Y is created, we have a combination of X and Y. I'll give you an example. With water, it's steam, liquid, and ice. Would you have been able to deduce one of the states just by looking at the other two? Would you be able to have concluded that there's a third state if you had only seen two of them? See, what that means is that water would have a fourth state, a fifth state that we don't know yet. But we will never know because every time we discover a new state, there will be another one. There will be another line spot. See? And we won't know until we see it, but by the time we see it, there will be another one. What if
we were creating a map of the brain, for example, of the human brain in one state, as in one point at a time. Is, so let's say like today, I copied my brain. So maybe it's not an actual representation of how the brain exists in the next moment. Yes, but do you think it's possible to a temporal watch?
Yes, it's a snapshot.
Yeah.
A snapshot. But a snapshot is not very useful, is it? Because at the moment the snapshot is taken, it's already irrelevant. It's already irrelevant. Yes, it's already irrelevant.
And these ones, aside from technology, but it taps into what you were talking about quantum. I find it fascinating. There's a scientist that he looks at water molecules. So I think that again, we're talking to a comparative side when it comes into that line, and they have so many. And then he's exposing the water molecules to things like microwave, TV, then to sunlight and that sort of thing. And he takes photographs of these different external influences. And then he also takes it to the point where they'll play like heavy metal music to the water molecule. And then people to send gratitude thoughts or completely negative thoughts.
Yep.
I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. I'll send you both the link so you can have a look at these photos. But again, it's that emotive part
Yes.
and the unconscious
We always ignore that.
the energy, and I call it the unseen energy, but it's so lovely to see these, and again, it's using technology, because if you think of the microscopic level that is able to see these water molecules, and then he's recording an intangible thing in a visual representation. It is
Yes,
a snapshot, but it is absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
So I'll send you both the link.
Please do.
You know, it's I had the book years ago, and it's only a tiny little one, but seeing all the different influences. So every time I drink water, I am thinking, yes, very great thing.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, because like just I'm attaching thought to something that's really good for my body.
Yes.
Yeah, and look, I've got nothing to lose, do I?
Yeah.
I've got a lot to gain.
Some level is
You
just
did-
energy, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
some physical level.
Yes. Yeah, so I'll send you that one.
And I wish we could normalize crying.
Yeah.
If we normalize crying, a lot of this would solve a lot of this. A lot is built on the assumption that crying and sadness is bad.
Right.
It should be avoided or minimized. But that's not true.
No, crying is
Sadness
it's the ultimate expression.
It's the ultimate. It's an expression as well.
Yeah.
It's an expression of strength in masculinity, in fact.
Definitely.
And so
I love a good cry.